Many young men dream of becoming preachers because they believe that it's from the traditional church pulpit that they can best herald the message of Christ and the gospel. And while that is true in some places, it's also true that the traditional pulpit has softened many would-be warriors for Christ into men who just really want to avoid conflict at any cost. These would-be soldiers dreamed of fighting bravely for the truth, but now the only time that they're willing to speak truth is when it isn't controversial, when they can virtue signal through it, when it won't offend hardly anybody in their audience, and when it won't challenge any long-held doctrinal beliefs. At a lot of places, the devil has found a way to take the Lord's cadets and to turn them into unthreatening nice guys while still granting them the title of preacher of the gospel so they can believe themselves to be courageous. You know that old saying, the sun that softens the butter hardens the clay? In this video, I want to talk about two dangers, two ways that the pulpit can soften a man into something that God never intended him to be, and how the pulpit can turn those who dreamed of being courageous fighters into enigmas that have no courage and no conviction to speak when it actually matters. And I don't make this video to discourage anyone from going into the ministry or filling a pulpit somewhere, but just to let you know of some of the dangers that maybe are not foreseen when you originally feel the call and the conviction to enter that kind of work. And how, if you're not careful, the roaring lion, the devil, he can stalk you down even while you're in the pulpit. I want to talk about two potential dangers, one internal and one external. The first one is internal. It's the internal constraints that a man is tempted to place on himself when he takes a position in a pulpit. Let's say that he takes a job and he resolves, as I start this job, I don't want to say anything super controversial. I just want to say things that are uplifting and that most people are going to agree with. And sometimes this just continues on for years. At what point does a preacher say, okay, now is finally the time I'm going to step on some toes? Sometimes a preacher just isn't comfortable doing that. And so these kind of positive, feel-good, uplifting messages that don't call anyone to Christ-likeness, that don't call anyone to repentance, that don't challenge a congregation to be better, that doesn't ever step on their toes or say things that they don't want to hear, those messages never get preached. So the pulpit just ends up softening somebody into this preacher who just kind of says things that are acceptable and that he knows won't be a threat to anyone who's listening to him and certainly won't threaten his job. Now, what a preacher will do sometimes to make themselves feel better about this is they will preach a controversial or an edgy sermon. But the thing about it is, it's always directed towards people outside of his immediate audience. It's always directed towards some other denomination, what they do wrong, or perhaps the world, right? The immoralities of the world. And this preacher really preaches it hard that the world needs to repent and the world needs to get their life together and they need to come to Christ and they need to, put all their sins behind him. And so he's done with this sermon. Maybe he's done a little bit of yelling or banging on the pulpit and he feels like, I'm a real bold guy, I'm a real courageous guy. But it's a kind of a faux courage, right? Because the people in the world are the other denomination, they're not there to hear this sermon. And so it's just basically like preaching to the choir, preaching to all the people who already agree with you, right? Because the people in that audience, they all agree with you. So what's controversial about what's courageous about it? Nothing. So I think sometimes preachers use this to make it look like they're a real bold preacher, but really what they're doing is kind of masking their cowardice. God didn't make you the preacher to such and such a denomination across the street that you disagree with. If you're not out on the streets preaching or preaching in some public way, God didn't make you a preacher to those people. He made you a preacher to the people who are there at your church. So preach to them instead of everyone else who can't hear you in your fake boldness. So that's the first way that the pulpit can soften an individual. It's this desire to maintain good relationships with the people we have to see every Sunday. It's this desire to not have to get into conflicts, perhaps not to have difficult doctrinal debates or discussions, to not have to, step on people's toes and call them to be better, or perhaps to confront somebody about their sin or, some problem that they have with another brother in the church or something like that. It's just a desire to kind of keep everything status quo, everyone happy, so that, you don't get in trouble with those people and you get to keep your job and your salary. Now, the second danger that I see in the pulpit, the way that the pulpit softens preachers, is I would consider more of like an external force. And this is one that also begins in the heart of the preacher. There's a temptation, and that is they look out to the external world and they think, like preachers are ambitious. These men are ambitious like other men, and they think, well, if I say this controversial thing, whether it's from my pulpit or whether it's on social media, it might kind of endanger my ability to move up the ladder. And anyone who thinks that that's not a real part of preaching in most Christian communities is mistaken, because it is. It's like there's kind of a ladder that many preachers climb. Maybe it's to the bigger church in the next town over, or maybe it's to get invited to be a guest speaker or to be on a conference or something like that. And, there's a temptation to say, well, if I start saying things that are really controversial within, to the people who are kind of in my community, and I'm calling them to be better, I'm challenging them, I'm pushing them towards Christ-likeness in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, and I'm pointing out truths that maybe not everyone wants to recognize, that is going to threaten my ability to kind of move up this ladder or to get the invitation to the big conference next year. And so what you get sometimes is these preachers who they're only willing to speak when it in some way benefits them, when it kind of makes them look good or look positive, or it makes them look like an encourager, allows them to virtue signal, or they say the popular thing when it's popular in the culture or in politics or in some kind of a cultural event. They're always willing to say the popular thing and kind of agree with everyone and say things that make them look wise and sometimes in line with the secular culture. But whenever there's a real difficult truth to point out, whenever we need to speak truth into a difficult situation, when the world and maybe even half of the church is against us and opposed to us, they remain silent. Let's say that they study a doctrinal topic and they come to a conclusion that's somewhat controversial, but they actually think that the text leads them there. A lot of times they'll just kind of keep that quiet. Sweep it under the rug. It's like, I'm not going to say that. It might be my conviction, but I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to teach it, even though I think it's biblical, because saying that out loud would kind of put me on the fringes of my Christian community. And again, might threaten my ability to get another job somewhere else, a better job, or, to get that invite to be a guest speaker somewhere at another church. So while the first way that the pulpit can soften is kind of a desire for safety and peace, this one is kind of a desire for upward movement. Rather than becoming this great warrior who speaks the truth, no matter what, in any situation, this is kind of a political softening almost. You know how politicians, they always want to kind of say the right thing. Sometimes they don't really say anything so that they don't say the wrong thing. And they're always willing to throw their 2 cents in when it's popular and really act like they're real into it and real bold when something's a popular stand to take. But then when something's controversial, their words are like mixed, or they're just silent on the issue, or they don't say anything. It's kind of the same. Where your ambition to go up the ladder softens you from being that hard-edged truth speaker. There's no doubt that if you do preach this way, this kind of soft way, that you'll have more friends, you'll get more invitations, a lot more people will probably like you and like your social media posts and talk about how positive you are all the time, but at what cost? If you're never willing to take the controversial stand because you're worried about how it's going to affect your career and your speaking opportunities, well, at that point, you realize what? I'm kind of in this for the wrong reason, and I'm probably not in it for the reason that I got into it. I wanted to be a bold gospel preacher, and now I'm kind of a politician preacher. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of gross. You don't want to be that. And so if you have found yourself, in either of these situations, you find yourself currently maybe in either of these situations, having been softened by one of these temptations, there's time to change, right? You can begin speaking boldly to your congregation and speaking about the wider world more boldly, and kind of put down the facade of just getting along with everybody and agreeing with everybody all the time. And I also want to make this video to talk about some dangers that maybe people haven't thought about when they get into preaching. I know a lot of people go into it really innocently, and that's good, and they just want to teach the truth and preach the truth to souls so that they can be saved, and that's fantastic. But there is always other factors that come into play when you actually get into the business of doing this, and especially because in some cases it is, in a sense, a business, because people are getting paid to fill church pulpits or to be in some kind of ministry capacity. So I just want to point out these two dangers and encourage people, don't let the pulpit soften you. Jesus certainly wasn't a soft man. He was a man of compassion and conviction, and he never wanted to get into confrontation when he didn't have to. But at the same time, he wasn't afraid of it when the truth demanded it. And that's the kind of balance that we need to have.